I'm sure you all know this feeling. When you've worked super hard on a project, you've had to hone your skills, you've had to push yourself further than you thought you possibly could, and then you get the thrill of when you finally get ahead of the competition and you can celebrate what you've achieved with a team that you know has your back. Our next speaker, Pierre-Alain Guillou, didn't just learn this from his life in the startup world. He learned this while he was building disruptive travel products at places like Skyscanner. He was simultaneously a professional PC gamer. To win tournaments, he told me, you have to be totally in sync with your team, be ready to think on the fly, and most importantly, put together a crazy amount of passion and dedication. Now, as head of product platform at AirHelp, Pierre is helping this Y Combinator-backed company of 600 employees create and maintain a culture full of this kind of fire and passion while they grow at a rate of over 200% year on year. Let's give Pierre a huge hand.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. First of all, thanks for coming back. It's a pleasure to be here today. And today, so what I'm going to talk about is growth, but specifically what our growth culture at AirHelp is. And even more specifically, I'm going to teach you how to actually break windows and kick down doors to actually get where you want to be. First of all, I'm going to introduce who I am, and I'm going to introduce what AirHelp does and who they are as well. So I'm Pierre. I'm the head of product of B2B Products in AirHelp. I belong to a team of about 27 people that actually constantly grows, made of product, growth, also data and design people in general. I've been in Skyscanner and Amadeus in the past, so the travel industry is kind of where I belong now. And on the side, I'm a drone pilot, and I love video making in general. So this is kind of one of my passions. And I work for AirHelp. And AirHelp is a Y Combinator-backed company. We are the biggest flight delay compensation player in the world. And I'll come back to it a little bit later to detail what actually I mean. We have over 550 people in the company as of today. One important thing is that it also applies to our C-level and management team. So they are spread across 6 different cities, and we have a bunch of people working remotely, etc. So I'm not going to talk too much today about it, but this is also a very important part of our culture. And so what do we do? We help passengers in the face of adversity in the end, and that globally. So concretely speaking, that means that when you have a flight that is delayed under some conditions, then you're entitled to a bunch of perks, and that also includes some money compensation. So this is really the core of our business. As of today, we have helped over 7 million people, and if you translate that in terms of compensation, that is over 200 million euros in compensation. So that was me. So what am I going to talk? If you want to have a look, a bit more detailed look. So I'm not going to talk about growth today, and I'm not going really to talk about it in a very generic sense of the term. And I'm also not going to talk about tactics like growth hacking very much into details. There will be some examples, but this is not the core of this presentation. The core of the presentation really is what is our take on what a growth culture is or should be. And if you take a step back, one of the goals of today's event and talks is to also share knowledge and share experiences and how we actually got there. And I'm hoping this is what I'm going to do. So when talking about growth culture, it's very important to note down that it's specifically important for companies that are in their younger stage, meaning that when you grow from 100 to 200 to thousands of people, it is critical to actually keep this culture along the way. And really what I mean by that is that you will start noticing silos, so people will have buyers when communicating, and to actually get things done, you will have to get a team talking to another team, etc. And you will also have your culture a little bit diluted along the way, because we'll see a bit later, culture is also built from the people you hire and from the people who are part of your company. So this is our secret recipe, really. And I'm going to talk about these three big topics and verticals, which are the people we have, the teams we have in AirHelp, the fiery culture we have, and I'm going to detail this later, and finally, the output of these two, which is experimentation as a whole. And we have a special stance on experimentation, really, and I'll give you some examples of what I mean by that. Let's start with one definition, actually, because we hear growth all the time, right? And everybody has their own interpretation of what growth is. So I will start by what our definition at AirHelp of growth and what it is. According to us, and for us, really, it is important, it is a very data-centric approach to experimentation. All of that wrapped up in a culture, a very specific culture that all the teams of AirHelp belong to. And this is applicable to every single team inside our company. All right, so I'm basically on stage here talking about growth. So to try and get some legitimacy, I'll present you very few numbers to actually show that ourselves we are growing. So this is essentially our conversion rate year on year for these specific years. And this is a bunch of information. You can come back offline if you like. But essentially, what it means is that we are growing between 30% and 70% year on year at any point in time. So yeah, this is a little bit of data about us. OK, so I'd like to start talking about growth, really. And then we'll talk about culture. Then we'll talk about experimentation. But first, growth. So the next few slides, I believe, are not my slides specifically. They are Y Combinator slides that are available offline and publicly. So being part of the Y Combinator also allows us to leverage this network. And if you talk to a bunch of founders from this ecosystem, you will discover that one of their main regret in the end is that they did not found a growth team specifically early enough. And now when they look back, they wish they did. So I'm going to talk very briefly about these companies. And they all have something in common, which is they had an amazing success, right? You look at Facebook, you look at Airbnb, they all achieved an immense success, but not by accident. They all achieved success by design. So it's not because their website was really fantastically pretty or their experience was so slick that I couldn't stop actually using it. It's because they had a design to achieve this growth. And by design, what I mean is that they specifically developed tactics to achieve and to push this one single metric that is growth across the board in their entire company. Doesn't matter which team, doesn't matter which discipline. So talking a little bit more about other examples. So I'm going to give some examples about other companies, and specifically examples that were put in place when these companies were way younger at the very beginning of their story. There's a really good reason behind it, but first of all, I'm going to describe what these are. They are also very famous, so I wouldn't be surprised if most of you actually know these already. But the first one, as a, let's say, growth tactic, growth hacking experiment, was the Dropbox one. So Dropbox, at some point, started some sort of sharing program where if you actually shared a Dropbox link with your friends, with your family, and they actually used it, then you were getting some free space. And of course, everybody was doing it. It was very cheap, and you were actually getting, I think it was 16 gigabytes at the time of data, so it was immense. So the result of this, and it was shared by the founders many times, is that they actually increased by 60% the number of signups permanently. That means not just in the months that followed this experiment, but pretty much all the time after that. The second one is one I really love. It's Airbnb. So what they've been doing is, at the beginning of their story, one of their competitors was Craigslist. People were actually posting their flat listing on Craigslist, and this is how you were actually finding a place to stay. So what these guys were doing is very smart. They wrote a script, essentially, that was sending automated emails to the people who were posting their flat listing on Craigslist. Something along the lines of, hi, I'm John. I'm definitely not working for Airbnb, and you should really check it out, because your posting really stands out of the crowd. It's a really high-quality posting, so you should check this service that is on par with what you just posted. And they really hijacked a lot of traffic like this, so they started ramping up their activities like this. Well, this is one of the tactics, of course. And the last one is my personal favorite. It's Reddit. And this is covered in many articles, many interviews, but the founders admitted this many times. And this is pretty self-explanatory when you look at the title here. But at the very beginning of Reddit, so I'm assuming most of you know Reddit, what they were doing, because not a lot of people were actually using Reddit, so what they did is they generated a lot of fake users, so bots, essentially, that were upvoting, downvoting, creating content, like removing posts, liking, commenting, all of these. And it was like a really Skynet community, that was really interacting with each other, and there was a bunch of real users in the lot, but not a lot. And this is not true anymore, meaning that, well, actually, I'm not aware of it. Now it's mostly populated with real users, but it's not only smart in the sense that they drove a lot of traffic on their website, they also shaped the way their service is being used, meaning that they coded their bots and their little script to actually perform the actions that they wanted real users to perform as well, just to be an example. So there's one really important common trait behind all of these, is that all these tactics, all these experiments actually happened when the companies were super small, right? They were in their hyper-growth phase, and they had to find growth at all costs. But this is not the important part. The important part is that these guys keep doing it. Even now that there are thousands of people inside these companies, they keep having the same approach to growth, and they keep putting in place the same growth tactics and growth hacking experiments, and really focusing on this heavily, even if they are massive giants of their industries now. And this is really the key point of this slide. So if you take a step back, this is really what growth is about, right? It's an innovation and creativity arms race, meaning that if you have a better product, but you don't focus on growth and you don't really have this mentality, you're going to lose. So it's really a matter, especially for startups and especially for young companies that are just starting to grow. This is a matter of life and death, really. So if you do not incorporate any of these tactics that we just discussed, and it's not exhaustive, of course, not comprehensive, but if you don't include these tactics, you will lose. And it's the same. It doesn't matter if you have a better funding than your opponent. You will lose in the end. So this was a little bit about growth, and now I'm going to talk a little bit about culture. So one of the hardest things to actually do with culture is define what culture means, right? And this is just one attempt. So this is an actual Buddha teaching quote that our CPO refers to quite a lot. And it actually has some meaning behind it, and we are referring to it a lot. But before I actually dive into culture, I'd like to take an example to explain a little bit what our personal stance is on it. So this is Abercrombie & Fitch. Again, I'm going to assume that most of you know it. And this is their revenue in 2017, meaning that in 2017, they made 571 million euros in revenue. So I'm not really going to ask all of you if you believe they are an actual e-commerce or not. I'm going to go straight to the answer, actually. We believe that they are actually not an e-commerce, but what we believe doesn't really matter. The why we believe it is important. So if you think about it, Abercrombie & Fitch is a retail company. Every single decision that their company takes, and every single cultural and company decision that they take, goes toward increasing their retail business. So now, make a parallel with the likes of Amazon or Zalando, for instance, as we are in Berlin. Zalando, for instance, they do A/B testing, they do experimentation, they do market generation, they do advertisement, they do all these things that are really tied very tightly to growth. And Abercrombie and Fitch did do this as well, but they do this at a really much lower scale, meaning that the subset of people inside their company that actually does it is super tiny compared to Zalando. And this is the key point of all of this, meaning that your culture is company-wide. All right. So I'm talking about what we define as culture in AirHelp. And if I had to illustrate this with one quote, this is the one from Damien. So Damien is the director of product and specifically growth at LinkedIn. And so although his entire quote is very interesting, the last part, the fire part, is the one that actually defines us the best. And this is also, by the way, the title of this entire talk, which is that if there is, like, if you tell anybody in your team that is actually heavily focused on growth, you have to get into this house. And they try to open the door, but the door is locked. They try to break a window. The window is blocked somehow. They try to go to the chimney, same story. They will try to blow a hole in the roof. And this is really what defined us. And ultimately, when you look at the culture of growth at AirHelp, it can be summarized very, very simply. It's do everything, short of illegal, to find growth. And this is really what drives us. Another aspect of culture is that people that you hire, that will compose your teams, compose your entire company, they are the people who will shape heavily your culture. It can be really a top-down culture that you try to impose on everybody, but ultimately, people are like they are. They will not completely change their attitude or their mentality. So the way you hire is also extremely important. And this is how we hire product in AirHelp. So typically, and when we say that to other, like when we try to have, exchange a little bit our experiences, et cetera, this is something that most other product teams are a little bit surprised by. We don't hire product managers, never. We hire people that might have product skills, but first and foremost, they are entrepreneurs. They are people who know how to literally break a window and actually get what they want to get, because these people have been going through the pain of actually building their own company, and they have been going through the pain of finding growth at all costs, because at the time, it actually mattered to them, and it was literally a matter of life and death for their company. And then we teach them product skills, because skills can always be taught. All right, so I spoke about growth, and I spoke a little bit about culture as well. And I'm going to talk about experimentation. Experimentation is one of the 3 pillars that we consider as critical for us to grow. It is also the output of the people and the culture that we have. So it is a culture of thoughtful experimentation, but I'm also going to add a little bit more to this. I'm going to say that this is also a culture of flowful experimentation. And what I mean by that is you should really fail. You should simply fail, and you should not be afraid to fail, and you should do that a lot. And we'll come back a little bit later when I give examples, but when you try things, there's really no failure, right? It sounds like a very, not down-to-earth thing that your yoga teacher would tell you, right? Like, don't be afraid to fail. You'll learn something anyway, right? But this is actually true when we try things in our tech environment. So a little bit about some numbers about AirHelp specifically. And there's a bunch of information on this slide, so I'll really try to highlight the most important ones. So last year, we ran 70 tests, A/B tests, and experiments in general. And this year, we're on the way to actually run almost 300. But last year, we ended up releasing 10 of them only. So that means that, and this is a metric that is actually true still as of today, meaning that we failed, into brackets, in 92% of cases. The reason why fail is into brackets is actually not anecdotal. It's very important. These 92%, you could say, well, tough luck. We binned everything, and we just continued working blindly, right? But no, they actually taught us something, all of these. So we managed to change our vision on things. We managed to iterate on our approaches, on our assumptions, etc. And just a few examples to understand also as well what we were doing. So some examples of tests that lost into brackets. So typically, we tried removing steps in our funnel. So like most companies in an e-commerce or tech business, we have a funnel, and we try to remove some steps. Our assumption was we'll make it simpler for people, we'll make it a little bit quicker, less friction, etc., the classic stuff. And we measured it many times, and he failed, in the sense that our metrics that we're measuring were performing worse. So let's pause for a second, and let's move on to the test that actually won. So there's the counterpart, which is that we added more steps to the funnel, and this one actually performed better for some reason, even if we actually believed it would be more friction, a little bit more complicated. We hid the compensation amount that you would get if you file a claim with us, and this surprisingly also improved conversion. And why am I actually going through these examples, as cool as they might be? Your intuition really sucks, right? And we are power users, especially when you talk about your own product and you start thinking you know what you should be doing, right? This is part of intuition. And I'm not saying that there's never a case where someone's going to have a really good breakthrough and they are going to know where they want to be and how they want to drive their product. But ultimately, you have to be very careful because intuition is tricky and very often misleading. So do not A/B test. We do A/B test, but don't A/B test. We do A/B test because before that, we do something that we call mock testing. Mock testing is just a way to validate our hypothesis a little bit faster than A/B testing. And usually, the approach to A/B testing is that this is a very lightweight method to validate an assumption or a hypothesis, right? So I'll give you some examples of what I mean by mock testing. Just to give a bit of context, this is a product that our CPO used to work on. It's essentially a hotel booking funnel, right? Or tool. This is their payouts page. The problem they actually measured at some point is that 70% of the people landing on that page ended up going back on the home page. So they formulated a few hypotheses and assumptions, and the one that made the most sense at the time is that they could not change the dates on this page. So the page just before this, they could see a summary of the rooms they booked, the days they booked, etc., and they could change it. So their hypothesis is because they cannot change the date on this page, they want to go back. And they end up going back on the home page. So classic approach of a bunch of people. A/B testing, let's try adding a module on this page that allows people to actually change the dates, right? This seems quite logical, and this is something that a lot of companies do. For us, this is the opposite of fire. When I'm talking about the fire and breaking windows, etc., this is literally the opposite. This is actually building a war machine, right? And of course, I'm exaggerating, but we look at this one test in isolation right now. But think about the fact that this is multiplied by 100 or by 200 or by thousands in some companies like Netflix, for instance. They do experimentation at scale. So when they want to build these A/B tests, they have to be as lightweight as possible. And the goal is the same. It's very similar. It's to validate an assumption. So what we do instead is we mock test. So in this case, this is a very good illustration, they added a very ugly button on this page that says edit dates, right? It doesn't matter if it blends well in the UX or not. This is to validate an assumption. So upon clicking on this button, there's no module, nothing. It just presses the back page button in your browser, and you're taken back to the previous page. And it seems silly, right? But the job is done. You validated your assumption that people actually wanted to edit the dates. And then you can move on to A/B testing, and then you can move on to the phase where you actually figure out the best way to do it. And this is an example, another one, that is very dear to us because it's actually something we've done in AirHelp. We wanted to build a referral program, okay? And it's not as brutal as a loyalty program, for instance. Because when you think about a loyalty program, it's hard to test, because if you put it out, then people start accumulating points and they want to redeem them eventually. But then if you say, well, actually, sorry, the test actually failed, we're pulling back everything, this is actually terrible for your user base, even if it touches a small percentage of them. So we wanted to validate the assumption that people will actually be interested in this. So what we've done is, so a referral program for us, by the way, means that when someone comes on our website and they have been referred and they get money from the airline, for instance, the person who referred them also gets some money. So upon clicking on this start button, what we've done, and this literally took 15 minutes to put in place, is to show this pop-in, which is, you just clicked on start. Thank you so much for your interest. We'll come back to you as soon as this feature is ready. And this is fire. this is validating our assumption that people actually were interested in this. And then we could proceed to building an MVP and et cetera, et cetera. And OK, this is a little bit different, but this is also one special one that is really amazing. So like, you'll have websites, pages, funnels, et cetera. And if you want, like, pro tip, if you want people to click on anything, just put a red dot that has a 1 in it. It works. And so we tried this. We actually tried this. And what's behind it is very important. We'll come back to it in a second. We tried this. And so in the menu items, we put this red button with a 1 on it. And we increased the click rate by 80%. But not just this. We also measured that the conversion rate of people who did so did not tank, which is, I guess, the most important part, right? But we managed to drive a lot of traffic to these pages without tanking the conversion rate. So the reason why I'm actually showing this today is because most people, when they see this, their reaction can vary a lot. But sometimes it goes from, whoa, 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 this is not legal. You can't do this. Like, you're tricking your users. And other reactions can be stuff like, this is dishonest. Like, this is not for me. And this is exactly what the difference between our culture and other product teams' culture is. For us, again, we do everything short of illegal to find growth. Finally, talking about culture and talking about experimentation, I've mentioned several times that culture is company-wide. And this is also very important because even if, so in AirHelp, for instance, we have product teams, we have growth teams. So these two are obviously focused on growth, at least partially for the growth team. Product, sorry. But we also have HR, we have legal teams, we have operation teams, etc. Culture itself in AirHelp is company-wide. So to illustrate this is obviously an exaggeration, but this is how we see any legal team in the tech environment, right? Good job, guys. This is our legal team. And when I'm talking about kicking doors and breaking windows to actually achieve what we want to achieve, this also applies to our legal team. And they're an amazing bunch of people, and they do things that most legal teams don't do. So our business in Europe is based around a regulation. It's called AC 261. You can look it up. It's really protecting passenger rights in Europe. In other regions in the world, it doesn't necessarily exist, meaning that there's not necessarily a regulation that is going to protect these passenger rights. For us, it doesn't matter. We'll still try to actually put these in place, and we'll try to experiment, even on the legal aspect. And this is critical for us, meaning that when we hire some legal members of the team, we make sure they understand that growth is critical for us. So if I come back to my first slide, really the key point here is to understand that this is our secret recipe, right? We blend an amazing bunch of people in teams, and we are very critical when we hire, and we are very strict when we hire people because we want them to have the same culture. And we have a fiery culture, meaning that this growth attraction and almost addiction, is applicable to literally everybody. And finally, we experiment in the way I described. Of course, it was very few examples, but this is really our approach. So it's finding the shortest path to growth and to success. So if I had to summarize all of this into very few bullet points, and if you have to remember anything, I guess, is these three things. Do everything and anything short of illegal to find growth, of course. Focus on people, not the tactics. The tactics are just a means, a tool. The people are what are actually going to build your company, your culture, and they are the people who are going to be meaning the success, the difference between the success and the failure of your initiatives, of your company as a whole. And finally, build a culture that encourages creativity. Be smart when you do something and try to find ways that are not necessarily beaten paths, right? And really, these are the three pillars under which we do pretty much everything in AirHelp. Thank you very much.